Hello, and welcome once again to Beating a Dead Horse, where we tell you who lived, who died, and who deserved to die. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week we are continuing our 4-week adventure into the DC Extended Universe. Last week we did Man of Steel, which if you haven't listened to, whatever, there's not really a whole lot of continuity between our discussions. I don't know why I brought that up. But we are discussing Batman vs. Superman this week. We are going with the theatrical release just because I threw up a Twitter poll to try and decide which one we wanted to go with. More people wanted us to watch the theatrical release.
I want to quote my good friend here because he was the only one that provided an explanation. He demanded that we suffer as the masses suffered and watch the version the studio wanted in theaters. So,
which is it's a valid thing to have us want to do. We understand that the Ultimate Edition or whatever you want to call it expands upon and makes a lot of the scenes make more sense, but to suffer as the masses have, as he puts it, is appropriate, I feel, for what we want to talk about, because it is the version that most people have seen and most people will defend. I also don't think that suffering is what either of us really did, actually. I wouldn't say that this is going to go up in either of our movies' Hall of Fames, but I don't think either of us hated it. I know you had a large reaction to it the first time you saw this movie, but I feel like the second time has kind of tempered it for you a little bit.
Yes, the second time has reinforced a lot of what I thought the first time without that raw edge to it. Because basically, what I thought about Batman vs. Superman the first time I saw it was that it was a waste of potential. That earlier in sort of our pregame discussion, I described it as like a puzzle that's been put together like a quarter of the way. Most of the pieces are there, but they're scattered around and haven't been put together yet, and a couple are just like missing under the couch or something. This movie had everything that it needed to be a good movie. It wouldn't require that much retooling to get something compelling out of this. But every interesting idea they had, every cool scene, every cool image was just being bogged down by a structural issue, a character motivation, character likability, character whatever issue. Basically, everything good about this movie came with a cost. And then in addition to that, there was a lot more bad stuff. So the first time, just because, for those of you who didn't watch the Man of Steel episode, I am someone who considers himself at least like vaguely invested in Superman as a character. The fact that in some ways they got closer than Man of Steel to doing something interesting and like making him relevant again, but still completely bungled it and just fucked up all its ideas, left a really bad taste in my mouth. So I really hated this movie the first time I watched it. Second time, my thoughts on it didn't really change. It was just more of a gentle disappointment, kind of like a wistful, like, what could have been in the hands of, like, a better director.
This is my first time seeing this movie at all, actually. As I intoned in the Man of Steel episode, have basically avoided the DCEU with the exception of Wonder Woman and Suicide Squad for some godforsaken reason. So to come to it a ways down the road, after seeing all sorts of negative blowback on it, seeing all sorts of positive blowback in response to the negative blowback, to just a continuous, there are two sides of this argument. You either love it or you think it is a pox upon the earth and needs to be scalded from it. I was left really middle of the road. I'm very want to agree with Jackson in that I think it was just kind of missing some key elements that would make it make sense. And maybe these are answered in the Ultimate Edition, and from my understanding, some of them are, but they weren't in my edition, and even if some of them are answered, I think a lot of the character oddities and just strange beats are going to remain constant. It might answer some of my issues where the fact that I feel like there's a lot of missing theme, or a lot of the themes are half fleshed out, but I don't know. So I'm just going to play it off as I thought it was a mess, but a mess that wasn't the worst thing I've ever seen. It was just kind of hollow. And just because before we start diving into a lot more of this, I'm going to kind of give a quick spiel on how I will relate this to the comics. And I'm not necessarily going to entirely relate it to the comics before you start telling me how I'm wrong for doing so. This is a movie that I feel both requires an understanding of the source material and wants to differentiate itself from. In honor and respect of that, I'm going to do my best to introduce any of my points about source material or lack thereof with an indication as to whether I am referring to it from a respect of source material or disregard of source material point of view, and additionally try and explain why I think this needs to be looked at in that regard. It's a really kind of tricky movie, especially a tricky comic book movie, to pin down how it needs to be viewed. There's just a lot of context to it and a lot of issues that go into how it wants to be perceived that I think need to be taken as a case-by-case basis. And I think that's actually part of the problem with it as well, just while I'm on this tirade, because you either need your movie to accept the source material or reject it. And this constantly straddles the line, as I said, on a scene-by-scene basis. You go from a scene where you need to understand Batman's character to let this scene have some sort of an impact, but then the next scene you want to throw that out so that you can just embrace that Superman is whatever. It's bizarre, and I think, in my opinion, does the most damage to this movie. It's hard to watch as someone who understands where it's coming from.
So someone who has only like a vague understanding of the comics, and as someone who is mostly coming at this with the context of like the movies, is like the previous like Batman and Superman movies. One thing I will say to this movie's, not to its credit, but maybe to its defense, is that it was in a bit of a weird position, in that it sort of feels like they didn't want to make this extended universe, but Marvel's success with the Avengers maybe kind of forced their hand into like trying to do all this stuff. Because one thing I think we're gonna like brush over mostly is just how much like guff for like world building and Justice League nonsense there is in this movie. Wonder Woman basically doesn't need to be in it, and you could make a completely like good coherent movie just around the concept of like Batman versus Superman. But the problem is that not only does it have this context of trying to compete with Marvel and basically play catch up, but they need to make a new Batman that will be distinct and memorable after the Christian Bale version. And, I'm not sitting here saying that Christian Bale's Batman was one of his finer performances, but those movies are really well regarded. People like those movies, even if Christian Bale's, like, specific portrayal is often criticized, like, overall, those movies were still in the public, like, consciousness. So, they have to make it distinct from that version. They have to make a follow-up to Man of Steel and try and do damage control after their little experiment, whatever they were trying to do, that didn't work. And then they had to, like, set up for, Justice League or whatever, because that would be what's expected of them. If I were in charge of, DC, I wouldn't have fucking worried about trying to set up for a Justice League movie. Like, it would have been best if they had just gotten good movies of the individual characters first and then tried to see if they could do it. And if they couldn't, then, not everything needs to follow that model of the, like, extended universe, because that has its own problems, as we've seen with a lot of samey feeling Marvel movies. So I think in defense of the people who made this movie, they were in a tough spot, and it's not one that I would want to be in. And that's never really a good thing to say, and it's not an excuse for why the movie is of the quality that it is. But I think the filmmakers themselves were trying to wrestle with some of these issues of how familiar and iconic characters are. Because the thing about Batman and Superman is them and Spider-Man, like, pre-MCU, were the most famous comic book characters. They were the most famous characters just from, like, their cult. They had more, like, cultural weight, probably along with Spider-Man and the X-Men because of their previous, like, successful movies. But they had more cultural weight than, like, Captain America or Iron Man until they got, like, big, successful movies. So, in a way, these characters are almost too iconic for their own good.
I mean, for sure. The whole idea... This is clearly... And, I mean, we're just reiterating this point now. Where this is clearly a movie where the faults are because of expectations more than anything. And not expectations of the audience, but expectations of producers and directors and anyone else involved in this, because they are expecting a movie that is both of Marvel caliber and is appealing to the comic nerds, but also appeals to the general audience and wants to hit all the major beats and be different enough that it stands unto itself, but recognizable for everything else. And it took Marvel years to get there. DC tried to do it in 2 movies. And, I mean, it failed. I don't... As I've said, this isn't a bad movie for what it is. It's a bad movie for what it isn't. And what it isn't is anything that these executives wanted it to be. Because they wanted it to be everything to everyone. So before we just continue on this tangent of our theories as to why this movie ended up the way it is, we're gonna kind of start to lay into spoilers. Like usual, we're gonna start at the beginning and kind of get deeper and deeper as we go along. This one's gonna be a little bit more fluid though, just because there's a lot of overlap that we're gonna kind of go back and forth on. So if you tend to only listen to the beginning, not expecting much spoilers, you might want to, hold off on that, just because we don't really know how we're going to go on this one. We are, however, going to pick up where we left off on Man of Steel, which is to say, the rampant destruction and death within. Obviously, this is the movie that tried to answer for Man of Steel after it just had gratuitous city destruction and incredible amounts of explosion and debris and yada 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 for the sake of having incredible amounts of explosion and debris and yada yada yada.
You know what? I actually think this scene is pretty good. I think this scene does exactly what it needs to do and gets the movie started off on the right foot. In fact, I think this scene does its job a little too well. Because the clear purpose of this scene is to establish why Batman would hate Superman and why he wants to fight him and kill him. And we get that. We just get that. We get the ground level view of, Superman and Zod fighting and all the explosions, and it's a lot more vulnerable. There's a lot more focus on the individual civilians on the ground as Batman rushes into, the cloud of smoke, again, 9/11 imagery, as he tries to, help the girl and talks to his assistant who's working in the Wayne Tech building. And interestingly, actually, I remember we need to make a correction for something that we were talking about last week, because last week we were talking about how they retconned it in this movie so that no one died in the Battle of Metropolis. But in the opening scene, that is very clearly, people very clearly die in this opening scene, and it very clearly, like, weighs on Bruce Wayne, and there's that shot of him, like, looking pissed off, like, towards the sky, like, kind of helpless as Superman and Zod keep fighting, and I think that all works pretty well. But the problem is that once we have Batman's motivation for why he wants to fight Superman, it never really evolves beyond that. He just hates him the whole movie until finally he builds a stupid robosuit and decides to kill him. So this is a long movie, and we're just waiting for Batman to do some CrossFit, have him sneak around, do some dumb detective work that's really laughably simple, and
So bad. Oh my god.
and but everything we need to know. There's no real development of his character. There's no question of whether he had misjudged Superman, and there's no, like, incident that makes him decide that it's time, that his first impression was right. He was right not to trust him, and that it's time to do the deed. It's just, this first scene is all you need.
I don't. I'm in a weird position where I don't agree with you, but I don't entirely disagree with you. Because I didn't get the motivations of hate from this scene that you do. I can see this sowing the seeds of distrust. I can see this sowing the seeds of concern and worry. I can see this sowing the very Batman seeds of concern and worry. Like, this is where Batman would create kryptonite weapons and everything like that. It makes sense here, but I don't see this being a scene that promotes a hatred. And part of that could be that I am coming from comics where, especially in some of, like, the shortly before New 52 era events, mass destruction was just the norm. At one point in an early story, the entirety of a city gets wiped out, and, like, it's by a pseudo good guy at the time, so it's all kind of a little weird for me, and I see where this would sow distrust. And I know I've said this a couple times now, but I don't see where this would create hatred unless. All right, I'm actually going to backtrack on that, because as I said, I come in from the side of comic books where this is the norm. So to have this be something totally new, which it would be, I suppose, for this universe, because this would be the first super battle that we are exposed to, I can see why this might cause some rage or concern. At the same token, though, Batman has clearly been operating on some level at this point, dealing with Joker and whatnot, so potentially he might have been used to this level of destruction. But I suppose if he's been fighting Joker, it's more of it's the villains causing this destruction. So he might immediately, like, almost Pavlovianly attribute this destruction to Superman as a villain. This has been entirely stream of conscious, so I have no idea how much of what I just made any sense.
Well, I kind of want to jump in, because I think I think it's an interesting point you bring up about this being this sort of comparison to the Joker, because I got a few thoughts on that. First one is that I think what sells me on the hatred is Affleck's performance in this. Like, his face, his reactions are very raw. Like, this doesn't seem like just mistrust to me. Like, he's, like, screaming into the phone and, like, panicking. Like, Affleck's performance without that prior context of maybe what, the Batman usually means. Like, that's what I'm getting. Like, a very emotional, very distraught character from this first scene. And also, I think that the fact that it is, like you're saying, coming as a surprise, because this is the first super battle in this universe, ignoring, like, Suicide Squad or whatever, because that wouldn't have been out at the time, maybe there is some hint that there was destruction on that level before, but we explicitly get, in that first scene, the Battle of Metropolis, 18 months ago, the world is introduced to the Superman, and it's played as this shocking turning point, and I think it's played pretty well in that regard. And regarding the Joker and the villains, is that I'm gonna use some battle forum terminology here. But Batman and his villains are all street tier. Like, if you think about just from the previous movies, again, using that context as just like a moviegoer, thinking about the Joker's plans in other movies in terms of raw devastation. Like in The Dark Knight, the final... and I realize that this is part of the problem, that we're relying on, like, the context of, like, The Dark Knight, which we shouldn't be. This movie should have its own context. With that said, thinking about the finale of The Dark Knight, where the tension is that there are these two cruise ships that are going to blow up. And, certainly that's a lot of people killed, but again, like, it shows that at best, like, Joker is going to cap out at what maybe a real-world terrorist would be capable of. The Metropolis battle that we see in Man of Steel even is just, above and beyond. Like, anything that we had, the level of destruction in any of these previous movies. I mean, that's precisely the problem with Man of Steel, is that it was really unsettling for that exact reason. So I just think without that context, I think it's easy to get enough, and if you don't get that hatred, I think you're right in that it's definitely a reason for Batman to mistrust him, and not necessarily one that would lead to hate, but I think that combined with Batman's general attitude throughout this movie, and his jaded, like, cynical worldview, I think it makes sense to me. Like, as a character motivation, like, everything that Batman needs to have a coherent motivation is lining up. But again, with the caveat that there is one piece missing, and that's the context of what Batman is usually like. Because, this is our first introduction to this Batman, so I'm forced to bring in my context from what would be, my frame of reference, which is the Nolan movies, where, Dark Knight in particular makes a big deal about why Batman does and should not kill. And this movie, when you're watching it, very clearly establishes, I think, that this is not the norm for Batman. Between what Alfred is saying, between their conversations, between just like a lot of visual hints, we can piece together that this isn't the norm for Batman, but that only makes sense if you have the context of the usual Batman does not kill. And here, of course, he, like, crushes people with trucks and, like, literally guns them down, like, literally shoots people.
And this is where it kind of starts to fade into Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, which, fair shakes, I haven't read. I'm familiar with it, but I don't know the entire, like, thematic elements of it or anything along those lines. But I do understand that the comic was more about making a point, in that this is where Bruce eventually kind of ends up because of X reasons, and it's not meant to be it was more meant to be a character study, something that was a in-depth look at what could happen if he continues going down the path of psychosis and anger. And in that instance, it makes sense why Bruce starts killing, and why in other stories like Flashpoint, where it's not Bruce, but it's Thomas Wayne who's Batman, and why he's killing. It's different characters at that point. But those characters feel like they've earned the right to kill, or have previous experiences which grants them that allotance. This Batman doesn't feel like he's earned these lethal options. There's no build up to it. We're just expected to believe that, oh shit, this Batman kills. And this kind of goes back to that whole idea of, what are we supposed to get from it? Are we supposed to know that Batman doesn't kill from those Christopher Nolan movies and be shocked when he does? But to do that, we'd have to have a better understanding of the original characters. Are we just supposed to accept that this character, this Batman, is a standalone character who kills without other knowledge of what's going on around it? Whereas if that's the case, then the kind of build up to him killing feels a little bit more odd, because in the beginning he doesn't kill. He's branding people, and there's this.
I'm gonna back up, but he's branding people so they'll be killed in prison. They explain that. That's the implication of the brand, is that these are like child predators who are going to be like ripped apart by the other inmates. Batman knows. That's why he does it. So it's supposed to be a big character beat when he doesn't brand Lex Luthor. But by that point, I'd argue that the character development is coming too little too late.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. You are right in that he is intentionally setting these people up to be killed. I don't know. I still just can't help. Maybe I can't see past my experience with the character in other media. Arkham games, comics, etc., etc. I'm so used to the not killing or the non-lethal Batman, and I guess I'm not as easily accepting of this Batman who clearly kills people, both directly and indirectly, just to accept it. There hasn't really been an iteration of Batman where they don't give some reason as to why he is acting as he is. It always feels like there's a build up to it, or it's a separate character or a character study or something along those lines. This one, we're just kind of thrown in with it, and as I said, this could entirely be because of just my familiarity with the character, and not. I need to distance myself from that in order to fully accept how this character plays. But as you said, the character arc in and of itself kind of is underwhelming. Nothing about it really sticks from starting to end point, and when he doesn't brand Lex at the end, it didn't actually feel like any sort of character change. It felt like he was more so just threatening him for some reason. I didn't feel like he was becoming more merciful. I felt like he was just angry, I guess. I don't know.
It was too little too late, because we needed man, I've got a lot of thoughts. So I'm gonna back up for a little bit before we get back to Batman's character arc, because that's gonna lead into a whole bunch of other tangents. But something I wanted to touch on, because I just wanted to propose an idea that I have that wouldn't necessarily make Batman vs. Superman a better movie in its construction, but I do think in some ways, like, it just goes to show how important context is. Because I think if this Batman was Christian Bale, and if this was canon to, like, The Dark Knight Rises, and I know that with the ending of The Dark Knight Rises that would cause problems, and, like, in reality, like, Nolan would never allow this because that was his one, like, stipulation. Ignoring all that, but just thinking about audience reactions and, like, being able to accept, like, perhaps a Batman that kills. Because you're totally right, like, that was one of the things that I was really mad about when I first watched this movie, is that, like, like, Batman shouldn't kill people. Just end all, be all. And I was more receptive to that idea on a second viewing, and I was just wondering, like, in terms of, like, making this an effective movie, if, like, tying it into that canon would have made people understand. Because then, like, that would also tie into that broader context you were talking about earlier of, like, you have these grounded, more realistic movies where, like, the threats are, like, street level, and then, like, it suddenly escalates. And we're given to understand that, like, this character that we've been following, that we have this context for, we could maybe understand what about this changed world would drive him to such an extreme decision. And like I said, I don't think that would necessarily make the movie a better movie, but I think it's an interesting thought, because I do believe that it would have made this plot element, I'm sure it would have been controversial no matter what, because we've already got a Superman that kills, and this is doing nothing to help rehabilitate the DC Extended Universe's grimdark image, but I do think it's just sort of an interesting thought process. Regarding his character development, though, it feels a little too little too late, because his big moment was supposed to be the one that everyone makes fun of, which is, the why did you say that name, Martha, brah, the Martha moment. That's supposed to be where he comes around and, like, teams up with Superman and, accepts his help or whatever. And, my hottest take for this movie is, like, that's always the scene that everyone points to as being really bad. My hot take is I don't think that scene is especially bad, and, like, with just a dialogue rewrite could have even worked a lot better. Because the other thing about the intro is that we waste more time showing, again, this thing that everyone already knows, because we've all seen the Tim Burton Batman or Batman Begins, and we all know Batman's origin story at this point. So we waste a lot of time on their origin story, and but in this scene, we kind of get it again in, like, a fragment. It's like a PTSD flashback. And I remember thinking that, like, as far as, like, showing how a character death is affecting Batman, like, that's a lot more effective than just showing me the same shit that I've already seen 100 times. And then, like, the Martha thing is a stupid line of dialogue, and that whole, like, train of thought is just poorly executed. But, as far as, like, your hook, like, you have a cynical Batman who's been jaded and, like, led astray. And through this conflict with Superman, like, Superman is going to be, the guiding light. He's going to inspire. He's going to do what he's supposed to do and, like, lead him back on, like, the path of justice and the path of good. Like, there. Like, that's an angle. That's a central conflict. I can get behind that. Here's the problem. The first problem is that Superman is no better in this movie than he was in Man of Steel. Literally the first thing we see him do, aside from, the Man of Steel flashback sequence with Bruce, the first new thing that we see Superman do is chuck terrorists through the wall, and we're then expected to believe that the terrorist man survived, and Clark still doesn't have blood on his hands. And it's just laughable, and it sets you up immediately to feel like, okay, this is where this is going, huh?
Yeah, I think this levity with death, and I think that's a good way of putting it for the context of this movie, is a levity with it, in that death is either not shown or understated or a secondhand thing, or in the case of Bruce branding people, where it's never explicit. It's cars flipping then exploding. It's, brands. It's him throwing somebody through a wall, and, in that case, he's not supposed to die. In the car exploding thing, it's clear that somebody died in it, but at the same time, it's never explicit. The only time when it's remotely explicit is when there's, him branding people and them going and explaining that that's the death knolls for anyone in prison, which, once again, even there, it's a secondary result. It's not as direct. So to have a bat that kills, you would need to actually have a bat that kills. It feels like he never commits.
Levity of death, I like that phrase you used, because it reminds me of what I actually think the worst scene in this movie is, and what makes me think that Justice League is going to be really shitty. The worst scene in this movie is after Batman has stopped fighting Superman. He's going to go save Martha Kent, and he takes out that room full of thugs, and he then blows up the guy with the flamethrower, and that's one of the closest kills he gets. That's to a direct kill, because he blows up the tank and then shields Martha, and the explosion takes up a whole room. It's ridiculous. And in that time, right after that, Batman looks at Martha Kent and says, "Don't worry, I'm a friend of your son's." And, with the charred remains of this man burning to death around them, Martha Kent looks up and smiles and says, "I could tell, the cape." And it's just such a awful, tone-deaf way to insert that, stupid Avengers kind of humor that makes me think that Justice League is going to be a train wreck. That whole movie is going to be that scene. Because I think Upon reviewing the whole thing, that's the worst scene in the movie, bar none.
I didn't even put that into context of this man's ashes raining from the sky. I guess if you want to play that game, I can tell it's my son's friends because he's just killed a whole room of people.
Okay. So, we're gonna let that one sit there. In case you hadn't thought about it that way before, there's my humble argument. That's what we should be making fun of more than the Martha scene, because like the Martha scene is like schlocky with its dialogue, but this is borderline sociopathic.
I really think the Martha scene boils down to what the way moviebob put it, and he put it absolutely incredibly as a great synopsis for this whole movie, which is intent versus execution. The intent of the Martha scene, I think it works. It's supposed to be a recognition of humanity within each other, an understanding of where they both come from, a shared past, a shared history. The execution is him yelling Martha and it triggering something in Batman, which is it's not a great execution. And that's all it boils down to, is the execution of it is really poor. So I agree. I don't want to slander this scene the way so many others have and cast the aspersions that it is just terrible, because the root idea of it isn't bad. It's just the way it was executed is pretty poor.
And I think it goes back. There was another thing that you were talking about that I sort of wanted to come back to with the representation of Batman in this movie, because I think as questionable as their representation of Batman was, they did Superman far dirtier, at least in the theatrical cut. I've heard that his point of view and his sections are more, that's the main thing that's improved in the extended cut. I can't comment on that. But with that caveat, Superman has learned nothing from Man of Steel. I remember one of the things I was saying last time is that I was not against the idea of having Superman grow into being Superman, of having, him sort of make some mistakes in his origin and like not get quite be there, but by the end of the movie, like grow into the big symbol of truth and justice, that we come to expect. And as following up on that, I also think that having this Superman not necessarily be trusted by the public, like making that the central question, like if people should be afraid of him, I don't think that's a bad hook either. What should theoretically be happening here is that we have a Superman who is now grown into the role and is more mature and not making the same kind of mistakes he would make in Man of Steel. And try to prove himself to like the public through his good acts, and just carrying himself like Superman would. And I'm thinking in the fight between Batman versus Superman, I remember before this movie came out, and especially with people who were not as into the comics or movies or just kind of knew the characters, like the premise sort of made them confused, because they were like, why would Batman be fighting Superman? Like, they're both heroes. I mean, in this movie, for it to work, you have to accept that one of them is not a hero. In this case, it feels like the movie wants it to be Batman, but even that's not entirely clear at sometimes, because it peppers in some, like, injustice, gods among us shit in there, with, like, hints at an evil Superman in the future. So, A, like, that's not entirely clear, and B, not only are they both heroes, but if they did fight, like, Superman would cream him. Like, Batman would be paced. And I think that is something that in the fight scene they should have played with more, and really gets to the heart of how they did Superman wrong in this. Because I've seen a lot of criticism for Henry Cavill, but I think, when he's allowed to be charming, when he's allowed to be kind, and act more like Superman, he does a pretty good job. But that's not usually what we're treated to. What we usually get is him, like, screaming, shouting, like, you'll be dead, like, yeah, thanks to my mercy, like, you're not, like, a smear on the wall, like, I'm screaming, Superman, I'm so edgy, and so, like, that's what we get, and that's what we're getting during this fight. Like, we get some lip service at, like, Superman trying to resolve this understanding of, like, Bruce, like, listen to me, like, help, my mom, and, like, I can buy that, like, for the premise of the fight, Batman, like, hates him so much he's gonna try and kill him. I mean, maybe, like, the plot of the movie should have been building to that more, because it feels like the fight just sort of happens out of nowhere, and that's, you know, the fucking awful pacing's fault. But for Superman's part, like, Batman, I like how that fight opens, where, like, he just casually deals with his traps and is like, come on, dude, like, stop fucking around. But, like, immediately, like, 5 seconds in, Superman goes into, like, rage mode and, like, tosses him through a wall. Whereas, like, the scene should play more like the final fight from One Punch Man, where like, One Punch Man and Saitama's getting, like, tossed around by this big, bad, like, alien boy, and he's not fighting back. Like, it's this really big, like, impressive scene, but Saitama's not putting any effort into, and that's what I think, like, that's the heart of how you make Superman interesting and compelling. You want him, again, to have sort of this moral dilemma and try to come out with, like, the moral victory. Like, this Superman should barely be fighting back against Batman, and the only reason that Batman wins is basically because Superman lets him and is trying to appeal to his humanity. And we get a little bit of that, like, at the start of the fight, but it just devolves into the same, like, screaming action sequence that we got from Man of Steel. And there's no consideration for having their ideologies differ. There's no consideration for having their behavior differ. They're both just the same angry, like, swole man. And that's what kills the movie. I can accept, like, a cynical, like, even a murderous Batman who's been led astray. I can accept that, just speaking for myself. But I can only accept that if we have that contrast. And there is no contrast in this movie because Superman spends the whole movie moping, crying, and screaming again.
You know, it really does. And that contrast is super important to everything with this. Like, you are 100% right. But because, and I'm going to go back to this because, like, the more I marinated on it, the more I've come to accept it. I think this is my biggest fault with the movie, is just how playful they are with death. Like, nothing in this movie has any weight to it. There's no weight to Batman, branding people for death. There's no weight to Superman chucking people through walls. None of it does anything. So there's never any direct characterization of either of the characters. You don't feel like either of them have some sort of moral that outweighs the other. It's just, one of them is a super-powered version of the other, and I think that that's what it boils down to. They are the same in so many ways, but one has the powers of a god, and sure, there's an argument to be made that's the whole point of the movie, that they are the same, and that's what the Martha scene reveals. But they're clearly trying to be separate individuals throughout it. Like, that's what the whole idea is that they are different people. That's why they fight. As Jackson was saying, one of them needs to be portrayed as a villain. Or, if not portrayed as a villain, one of them needs to be convincingly villainous to the other, which doesn't happen because Batman sees Superman as a imposing threat where he's creating his own justice upon the world. But isn't that all Batman's doing, is he's branding people for death and slaughtering them in their cars? And Superman sees Batman as... What the fuck does Superman see Batman as?
So, an imposing figure dealing his own justice on the world.
There's neither... That's the problem. Neither of them are really villains to each other. They are two sides of the same coin. It's dumb. That's all I have to say.
I agree with everything you just said for the most part. but I do think there is one death in this movie that is given any amount of weight. And that, of course, is the death of Superman himself.
I'm already done with it. I'm already done. Look, the first death of Superman was a landmark comic issue. It was a huge deal, and it sold gangbusters. It made Superman interesting again, as to quote Max Landis's Death and Return of Superman. There's a lot that it did with it, but it was also a shameless cash grab by DC to bring recognition and make Superman interesting again. He had been kind of stale, and the market was looking for something new, someone who wasn't just the Boy Scout with invincibility. They wanted something to change about it, and so to kill him was a huge deal. I feel like this movie kind of plays on that as well. Like, there's almost just an expectation that we need to kill Superman in it, and I don't know why they did it. It's so weird. And the original Death of Superman, there was months of serialization of other comics before he eventually came back. This one, we know he's coming back for the next movie. Like, had they pulled a Marvel with, Captain America disappearing, we haven't seen him in a movie, with the exception of a video of him in Spider-Man Homecoming, for like 3 or 4 movies now. Because it's, he's supposed to be gone. To have him come back to the next movie, and there's clear recognition that he's alive with his weird coffin thump, which, what even was that? Was that supposed to be his heartbeat? Because, whoo boy. I'm mad about this one. This is the one thing I am actually a little mad about.
I would say specifically that shot of like his heartbeat. I didn't think of it like that way. I didn't give it that much thought, actually. Second worst scene in the movie, I would say. Because you know what? I can think of a potential thematic purpose for killing Superman in this film. I don't think the way they did it is very good. Bringing Doomsday into it was unnecessary. Just another, the movie was about Batman versus Superman. It should have just been about Batman fighting Superman.
Batman versus Superman versus Lex versus Doomsday versus Wonder Woman versus the U.S. government versus
the trailer for The Flash and Aquaman
versus the people.
Versus the people. So I can think, because there's one sort of thread. There's one thread going throughout this movie that if they leaned more into, I think could have been really interesting and emotional and made Superman more. I think it would have, because, it's a common, we were talking a little bit about this last time, how Superman hasn't really been relevant for a long time. And these movies have failed to make him relevant even still. And, there's always, the same criticisms that keep popping up. He's too good, he's too strong, like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the thing is that, with those, it's always interesting to me that Superman in particular gets these criticisms, because those same criticisms you could level at, like, a lot of other characters, like, who don't get it so much. Like, for example, like Captain America. Like, people love Captain America precisely because he is, like, really good. I mean, I think Civil War sort of downplays that by making him, like, kind of a selfish dick. But, that's sort of what he's praised for, is his, being the, idealistic character on the team. By the same token, on the other end of the spectrum, thinking about, I'm a big Dragon Ball fan, and Goku doesn't get the same criticism that Superman gets for being too strong most of the time, despite being just as strong as him. And so I'm left to think about why that is. And I think, like, that just the character has been presented in this boring, stodgy way, like, so often, that element of humanity, of, like, why we should care about him, has been lost. And there's a thread throughout Batman vs. Superman where it's exploring this element of Superman's humanity that I think could have been, like, really, like, emotionally effective, because that's the ultimate, that's sort of, again, the criticism of Superman is that he's perfect, and because he's a god and can do anything. But what brings him down to the level of a human more than actually dying? And there's other, like, it's not the only time you can see this. Like, when the military, like, stupidly decides to stop Superman from doing the smart thing and, like, send Doomsday into space and, like, nuke him in orbit, like, right over town. Like, they even say, no, it's stupid.
Oh my god, it's just the Iron Giant!
It's just the Iron Giant. But, in that scene, the general even says,
You stay, me go, no following?
Not quite. The general even says, like, when they're arguing about whether or not they should do it, they're like, there'd be no casualties. Like, he's beyond the threshold, like, hurgle, burgle. And the one guy's like, hey, like, there would be a citizen casualty. Like, we'd be killing Superman. And then there's that and the, question that Lex, poses about, the problem of evil is applied to Superman. If God is all-powerful, he cannot be all good. And if he is all good, he cannot be all powerful. And I think leaning into that second part of how, despite his overwhelming power, like, Superman still has feelings, and Superman is still, like, despite everything, just a guy trying to do the right thing. I think that could have been a really like emotional beat to have him kind of make that sacrifice and reestablish his humanity that's maybe been sort of lost with these other iterations.
Yes, you are absolutely right about that. This, theoretically, in a better movie, could have had a nice, poignant punch to it. But we know he's back in the next movie. He's been around for 2 movies. If this had been a character that we have established prior in any meaningful manner beyond just Man of Steel, if this was, Avengers Infinity War 2 where they killed somebody, we might have more of a care about him. Instead, we're just, it doesn't matter. We know he's coming back because it's Superman. We know that he's got the heartbeat. He's got the next movie coming out. There's no weight to his death. Even if they had executed everything else flawlessly, I don't think this death would have stuck, because none of it's still despite being a more quote unquote serious death, there still has that levity around this death, because we all know it doesn't matter. None of it matters. Executed perfectly, this wouldn't matter, because it's just going to be undone in 10 minutes as soon as Justice League comes out.
Overall, I mean, I don't disagree with anything you just said about the heartbeat, about the fact that we've only known him for 2 movies. He barely gets screen time in this one, and he's not particularly likable in the other. All that's a problem. I do maybe disagree that executed perfectly, that this might not have had any impact. Because I'm thinking about The Dark Knight Rises, a movie that I don't even love. In fact, I really don't like that movie at all. And Batman didn't even die in that movie. But it's a similar sort of thing where, like, he sacrifices himself. And that didn't feel nearly as weightless, even though he didn't actually die. Just from the fact that, like, we have spent 2 movies, or 3 movies, I guess, like, spending the whole time rooting for him. And so I think that, executed perfectly, and I don't even know if they would have to commit. Like, yes, maybe Superman was always going to come back because of corporate deals or whatever. You're not going to kill. It'd be like Nintendo killing Mario or something. Like, you're not going to do that. Yes, but I do think that there is something to be said, with looking at a movie, like, within its own context. And, I know there's a big asterisk on that. But I do think there is something to be said, like, looking at a film through its effectiveness in, like, how well it executes its goals. And like we were kind of talking about with Civil War way back, like, how maybe it would have been more emotionally resonant for Iron Man to, like, kill someone. But even though that may be true for Civil War, it would have created a lot of problems for the rest of the universe. I think it's the same sort of thing here, and that, if you had made, like, a really great movie that ended in Superman's death, but even so, like, the next movie he came back. I don't think that would necessarily remove the emotional impact 100%. I mean, certainly for some people it would. For some people, like, that's never not going to be a mental block. But I think there is an argument to be made for, like, taking a movie on its own terms. And the asterisk, of course, is that this movie is clearly trying to set up for a bunch of other shit and does not want to be taken on its own terms.
Well, let's play a game really quick for you then. All right.
Yeah.
Let's take the the Nolan Batman trilogy on its own, and take this and Man of Steel on its own, just so that they both have previous movies. All right. And let's say Man of Steel and this were both executed in a flawless manner, and we both love it. We're huge fans of those movies. As we both like the first two Nolan Batmans, and the third one a little bit more lukewarm on. You don't like it as much, whatever. So Batman's death in the Nolan movie was purely so he could retire. Batman's death in the Nolan movie was not a death to show any sort of humanity to himself. It's a totally different meaning of death, in that it was so that he could escape this life that he had been trapped in, this life that he had grown tired of and acknowledged the problems within. In Man of Steel, Superman's death would be to prove his humanity, to become one with everyone else. Batman's return in those movies was merely his resurgence as not Bruce Wayne, a different pseudonym, but like, yeah, I lived and I just retired. To have Superman return from a death that is signifying his own humanity would be to undermine exactly what makes him human. He's already a Christ allegory. Then for him to actually return from the dead would not make him human. It would make him more of a god.
Yes, but if we're talking about Christ, that is sort of the point about Christ, is that he is both like a god, still like grounded in this human element. Like thematically it is a little at odds. And the other element about the Nolan movies that makes it sort of a wonky comparison is that Dark Knight Rises was meant to be a definitive end. Like, even if Batman had actually died, there was no threat of him coming back. What I'm more just saying is that let's looking at the movie just by itself, and sequels might contradict this movie's themes. Sequels might undo this or that, or go against like the spirit of the original. Sequels do that all the time, though. I can think of... I'm a big Zelda fan. The fact that there are any Zelda games that take place in Hyrule after Wind Waker is just a complete slap in the face to what that game was all about. About, like, finding your own way, about, like, moving on from nostalgia in the past, etc., etc., etc. And you could say that completely undoes what Wind Waker was, like, saying, and the emotional impact of Wind Waker. And, maybe on some level that's kind of true. But when I'm actually playing Wind Waker, when I'm watching that ending of, Link and Tetra, like, sailing off to find, like, a new adventure, it doesn't... The knowledge that, like, Skyward Sword and, like, Breath of the Wild and all these other games that come after it, the knowledge that they exist, for me, doesn't make the theme, doesn't make the impact of that particular, like, story any less resonant to me. In short, like, what I'm saying here is, like, there's a way to make this work if you remove it, not even if you just remove it from the context of, like, the other continuity. There's a way to make this work as, like, its own film. And I think, and again, we're talking about a perfect storm, which, A, didn't happen, so it's not really worth, I mean, maybe it's worth thinking about, but, it didn't happen, first of all, and the chances of it happening, just, again, with this maelstrom of, like, conflicting motivations of executive desires and fan desires and director desires and source material, not source material, like all that other stuff we talked about earlier, meant that perfect scenario was probably never going to happen anyway. But if it did, I think the ultimate damage the Marvel Cinematic Universe has done to filmmaking as an art is that it's eroding the importance of like the standalone feature, where themes, everything has to lead into another movie. And it's always been kind of like this. There's always been sequels around, but Marvel has made it more explicit than ever. And they're adopting this model with kind of Star Wars too. So really, like, Dark Knight Rises, thinking about it again, might have been like the last kind of comic book movie that even had the chance to have that kind of weight. Just because now we're giving into like the cinematic universe machine, because like if a separate Superman series it could totally end with his death and like reemphasize that his dedication was to man all along, or like emphasize the Christ allegory. But we're never going to do that because we have to keep making more DC movies.
I think the big part that I'm kind of hooked on, and I think that this would work better. I agree. I see where you're coming from for sure. I think the part that I'm stuck on, and this might be a part that would be removed in this perfect movie, is the heartbeat scene at the end.
Oh, in a perfect movie, the heartbeat scene is definitely gone.
Right, and if with that gone, yes, no, you are 100% right that this is a solid thematic ending. However, if the heartbeat scene had stayed, I think the allusion to his return would have weakened the theme in that instance. We are entirely arguing hypotheticals here, but
I think it's kind of an interesting discussion regardless.
No, I totally agree. That's why we've been doing it for 10 minutes beyond our usual cutoff point.
Oh, was I rambling that long?
No, we both were.
Excellent.
It is interesting. I don't know. I think there's context, and this is the type of argument that honestly, you and I could easily go back and forth on for the next 3 days as we slowly realize flaws in each other's argument, and I think we should probably stop at some point.
Like right now! Thanks for listening, everybody! Tune in next time!
Yeah! Thank you for listening. We have been Beating a Dead Horse. I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I also stream on Twitch every Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday at twitch.tv/helpless_Skippy.
And I am Jackson Keller. You can find me over on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller. We've all got 280 characters now. That sure is a thing.
Woohoo! I can talk about Dutch angles more.
Follow Sean if you want to see a bitch about Dutch angles. Follow me if you want schlock.
As always, we'd like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternate Take off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. Go check them out. They're a pretty awesome band. I like them a lot. We are going to be continuing our foray into the DC Extended Universe next week with Wonder Woman. So we're actually just kind of getting more receptive to these movies. We started off pretty critical with Man of Steel. We've kind of, not to say that we aren't critical of Batman vs. Superman, but, we're kind of understandingly critical, like in a way that we're like, yeah, I understand. You tried your best. Things
we were pretty gentle to this movie, and I do think it is legitimately more coherent than Man of Steel is.
Yeah. So, and Wonder Woman's next week, which I love that movie. There's like parts of it that we're gonna talk about next week. I promise, because it's all about death that I don't like. So I'm excited to talk about that movie. I'm excited to watch it. It's gonna be good. Before then, though, I'm going to leave you with a heartfelt, stoic monologue from the movie's kind of antagonist, Lex Luthor.
And now, you will fly to him, and you will battle him to the death. Black and blue, fight night. The greatest gladiator match in the history of the world. God versus man. Day versus night.
Man champion of the sun. You're a master of karate and friendship for everyone.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go